Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hi, everybody. Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, back again, episode 26. Today on the show, we have Ryan Myers, CEO of CranioSense. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
And I guess I'm officially a podcast veteran. Sounds like this is your second recording. It's very informal. We'll have a great time. And again, thanks for hopping on. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, you got 10x on me, but hopefully it doesn't show.
On this episode, we're going to talk about your platform, the iPass. I'll let you describe the acronym. I'm going to butcher it. But maybe before we get into the product, Ryan, we're always interested in the human element. Tell us your story. What's your background? Are you technical or are you more business savvy? And kind of what led you to leading a startup medical device company?
Sure. So my background, it's pretty dynamic. I guess jack of all trades. I have a technical background, but I definitely have always been interested in the business side of things, which kind of marrying the two worlds together. But yeah, so I went to, kind of growing up, I always kind of wanted to marry the two together, right? I was very technical focused, but, always was trying to hustle, for lack of a better phrase. Went to Northeastern for undergrad, did mechanical engineering, focused on biomechanics, so very technical from that perspective, but always taking a lot of business classes on the side. Went out for my PhD in bioengineering out of Northeastern as well. Studied in a neurophysiology lab, Dr. Joe Ayers, up in the Marine Science Center, literally World War II bunker that Northeastern bought for $1. So I worked underground for 5 years, which was an interesting lifestyle for sure. Graduated in 2017 and really decided that I wanted to see that research translate over and really be able to help people. And so the notion of staying in academia wasn't really, I guess, one that I thought I could achieve kind of that translation over into industry and really into patients. My focus has always been medical in nature. And so joined up at a company called Vivonix, which is really a great place where they focus on early research and development, right? They focus on getting government grants to fund really, risky ideas, really innovative ideas, and then to commercialize those, whether that be through a license deal or an outright sale. Or in our case, a spinoff, right? And so, all that in mind, somewhere in there, I fit in going back to school for my MBA out of University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, remotely. Highly recommend the program. About halfway through, focusing on entrepreneurship and M&A. So, I guess at this point, it is kind of the two worlds colliding all the way back together and co-founding CranioSense.
Oh, yeah. So Ryan, great background. Sounds kind of similar to my background, except for not quite smart enough to get a PhD or focused enough, and dabbled with the idea of an MBA, but went for the School of Hard Knocks instead. But great. So Vivonix seems like a great place to join after your PhD to explore new technologies. Is that where CranioSense came from?
Yeah. So, right around when I joined, we had a new grant that was being issued for this specific technology. In the DoD, acronyms with grants, Department of Defense. Traumatic brain injury (TBI) is pretty prevalent, right? There's blasts, there's things going off. It's really hard to diagnose. It's really hard to treat in the field, and so they've been on the lookout for a non-invasive way of essentially assessing casualties on the battlefield. And so we were able to secure some grant funding to kind of explore using near-infrared technology to kind of support that diagnosis. And so, yeah, that's really the birthplace of that and a few other neuro-focused devices that we were able to create with my time there. And so, essentially that's where it all began.
Okay, and so the product, I understand, it's called the iPass. Can you describe, the acronym for our audience and just generally what it is, when it's used?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So disclaimer, that's going to have to change. So we're going to have to do another podcast in a few years because
All right.
there's trademarks all over that. But when you're doing research and development, a nice little tagline or a nice little like acronym name is important to kind of, everybody can then, they don't have to say, the intracranial pressure assessment and screening system. That's a mouthful, right? So we just said IPASS after a while. So yeah, essentially it's a non-invasive way of assessing the pressure state and then monitoring it thereafter, kind of regardless of why that pressure came about, right? So intracranial pressure comes about due to traumatic brain injury and concussion, right? That's where a lot of people's heads go initially. But it also arises due to stroke, due to cardiac arrest. There's idiopathic reasons. So we don't quite know why those arise, but essentially there's people are walking around with elevated intracranial pressures, acute liver failure, sepsis, right? And a lot of times we think of it as a symptom of these conditions, but in reality, it ends up being its own treatable pathological state, right? And so what we do is we try to reduce the diagnostic burden of that intracranial hypertension diagnosis, and thereby getting the treatment sooner. And the way we do that is by using near-infrared light to look into the skull, and then assess kind of how the vasculature, so the blood vessels, are changing when that pressure builds up, right? So it's a very mechanical kind of process, right? Pressure builds up, blood vessels react differently. Fluid dynamics, right? All that fun engineering stuff we learned back in undergrad. And then we essentially, the secret sauce is we reference that to a point outside of the skull.
I see.
And by looking at that differential, we actually get kind of the patient becoming their own baseline, right? So we have non-pressurized blood vessels over here. We have pressurized blood vessels over here. We compared the two, and that's what we've been able to show correlates to intracranial pressure.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to ask, why not diagnose or look for concussion? And it seems like you're looking for symptoms, and certainly one cause could be a concussion or all those other areas you described. So it's a sort of a broader platform you can use in a lot of different disease states, which is smart.
Yeah, it's a platform of disease states is kind of how we think of it. Medical indications, etiologies, however you kind of want to talk about it. But yeah, intracranial pressure is kind of this broader problem set, and non-invasive intracranial pressure monitor assessment has actually been coined like the holy grail of neurology, of neurosurgery, because the only way to do it right now is to essentially put a hole in your head or a hole in your spine and manually assess the pressure, right? So we only really do that for like the really diseased folks, because it doubles as a treatment. A lot of the time you can actually remove some of the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid. So yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to ask that the treatment is clear. If you have increased pressure, you drain, right? I mean, obviously there are other treatments, but that's the immediate, treatment. Is that right?
Yeah, there's some pharmacological kind of treatments. There's surgical treatments. It kind of depends on, essentially what the etiology is, how acute kind of your setting is, how acute your presentation is. And so, yeah, that's certainly one of the more advanced ways of doing it. You essentially just remove, there's only 4 things within that cavity, the spine and the skull. Is, removing one of those essentially then would reduce the pressure. So removing CSF removes that pressure. In a more rural, or we say kind of remote care setting, you could do hypertonic saline, right? So that when you don't have a neurosurgeon around, you can really pump somebody full of hypertonic saline, create this like fluid transfer across the blood-brain barrier, and remove some of the water content from the brain. And then there's everything in between. Kind of that's the most inert, right? There's also drugs that do that too. So mannitol will do that as well. But yeah, those are the two extremes.
So you're developing this portable iPad-sized kind of GUI device tethered to the skull somewhere. I think I saw maybe the forehead, and then 2 reference nodes on your earlobes. Is that right?
Yeah. So we have that deep brain sensor, so that looks into the brain. And then on that same sensor, we have a forehead kind of sensor. So it looks at the vascular pool on your forehead. And then we have an ear, and then we have a finger. It looks like a pulse ox. So essentially we have 1 true pressure reading, and then we have 3 reference pressure readings. So Yeah, but then the rest is tethered to, a readout device.
Yeah, so that's it seems like a clinical need and a clever way to go about doing it. I guess so. You were working at this other company and decided to spin CranioSense off. Let's get into now. The speed to data portion of this podcast. Not everyone knows what speed to data is, but to me, it's what data is most critical to make you, Ryan, decide to kind of leave, a cushy job. I don't know, and go out and actually, put a dent in the world with this product. What data did you see early on to make you decide to go out and spin this company out?
First, I'm going to focus on the cushy job part. That just means in my mind that I look very rested and well kept after having worked really hard on whatever I was working on for so many years. No, it's what makes me want to spin this off. Obviously it's belief in the device, and there's certainly data that supports that. But I think there's probably various stakeholders looking at various data sets, and then the speed to get to those is a question for each of those, right? So certainly for us, right, it was being ingrained in the project, for 5 years, right, and saying, okay, well, let's take a step back, right? We could either do one of these few things. Which one makes the most sense for us? And so, we looked at kind of the data that was coming out of IPASS. We were able to publish a healthy human subject feasibility study, right? Because we were able to say, what we're measuring actually correlates to intracranial pressure. That was peer reviewed, right? So that was a big step in the right direction. And then we have an ongoing study looking at a direct comparison to the invasive sensors, right? And the data coming off of that was really, really powerful. That's not published yet, so that's a little inside baseball for us, but that's kind of what ended up getting my co-founder and I, Christian DiMatteo, to commit to spinning it off, right? We saw that it was working. We knew there was a clinical need, and now we're just essentially building everything around the link between those two, right? So yeah, it's been a road. There's other things going on, but
no, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, the clinical need and the prototype's working. If I may, I mean, I read the website. There's an invasive study going on, like 60 patients, and you're kind of wading through that. We'll get to that in a moment. But I wasn't aware of this healthy human study. So tell us a little bit about that. Because that seems like a pretty easy way to evaluate a novel medical device. Just put it on healthy humans. But did you induce some sort of intracranial pressure, or were there, I don't know, migraine patients or something that like sort of present that way? Or how did you do that?
With any kind of really novel push, right? You really want to try to understand how physiologically the patient or the person is reacting. I choose to capture as much data as possible, like throw every sensor that we possibly can on a person, induce whatever state you're trying to induce, and then record and then analyze all that data afterwards. We certainly had a central hypothesis, right? We had a thought that this reference kind of approach was going to pan out, but we threw on other things like non-invasive blood pressure. We threw on ECG, all sorts of things that, okay, if they don't change, then we know it doesn't have an impact, right? But if they do change, then we know maybe we have to take those into account in the end product, right? You don't want some weird physiological state kind of creeping up on you. But that said, a feasibility study in healthy human subjects is valuable to some degree, and then the value kind of stops, right? So we were able to essentially use a tilt table to put people at a positive 45-degree angle and then a negative 45-degree angle and everything in between. Yeah. And essentially induce a pressure change, right? Which that pressure change was already published. Yeah, the data, or essentially the algorithm to estimate what the intracranial pressure change was already published. So we were working off of that. And then what we would do is just put our sensor on and all those other sensors and be able to say, okay, well, we can track that change, right? Mm-hmm. And so we only published one of our physiological parameters, delta pulse transit time, which is essentially the difference between when the heartbeat arrives in the brain and when it arrives in another part of the body. We published that one physiological parameter and the accuracy of it, and the rest we kind of have to keep behind closed doors a little bit, secret sauce. We talked a little bit about IP, before the episode, but some of it's going to remain trade secret, right? We don't want to kind of divulge everything.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I love that story of, kind of hacking the product development process and literally leaning patients or healthy humans, not patients, over to induce healthy, intracranial pressure. If I may, like, what was the pedigree of the device that you were using in that study? Did you even need like an IRB and everything, or were you kind of just using the experimental setup you'd been using previously?
Yeah, it's a great question too. We've done a lot of clinical studies and clinical trials over the years, so we're pretty familiar with different ways to evaluate both internally, like, hey, is this working, and then externally, like, um, let's get some momentum behind us. So we talked about one of the stakeholders being ourselves, but then another stakeholder is our eventual customers, right? They're going to have to believe in this device. So we did some evaluation internally where it was, we were putting it on the principal investigators and tilting them upside and down. And we were like, oh, this is changing. This is great. Something's happening. And then we went through a formal IRB and recruited patients.
I see.
Or subjects, really. They were all healthy, so that made it a little bit easier as well. We didn't have to go through a hospital. It really specifically in order to publish, right? We wanted that momentum afterwards to say, look, this is working. So
Yeah.
it's a mixture of both, and we deploy them at different times too. So
Got it. So then on the invasive study, I imagine the one that's more costly and longer, ultimately with your target, I assume your target patient population, did you do a kind of call it a clinical trial device design following ISO 1345 design controls? And is that your ultimate commercial product that you're using in that invasive study?
this is great because I don't have to like be shady about the whole thing. We have a whole design history file.
Good.
We followed a 13485 model, but we don't have to go full. Like, we essentially have to go up to clinical release, right? So you need kind of the full package in order to get certified. But we modeled it after that first part. We did internal manufacturing, so we were able to kind of do those as well under various SOPs and making sure that that's all on the up and up. We essentially built a clinical system, right? So part of the secret sauce for us is an algorithm, right? So we're going to pack in a really intelligent algorithm into the device and protect all of that internal to the device itself. And so what we wanted to do was continue our data gathering. And so we built a system that essentially gathers our data, but then harvests data off of multi-monitors that are already placed in the ICU. And so we had to make that infrastructure. So a lot of what that system is right now, it's like a pole mounted system that sits in the ICU. A lot of that will be stripped away for the device when we go to market. It is in individuals that have had a traumatic brain injury or some brain injury. So it could be stroke, but they land in the neuro ICU and they have invasive sensors placed, right? So that's all of our inclusion criteria. We don't manufacture any of that. It just whoever presents that way and then their loved one's consent, we can then place our sensors on them and gather the data that we need to develop the algorithm. So we're about halfway through. We presented some of that data at Neurocritical Care Society last year.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting. It seems like you're following the kind of lean prototyping thinking of, mount it on a pole. It doesn't need to be the ruggedized, commercial product. Just get it in the clinic, get that data. So my follow-on question for the data you're collecting in the trial, I mean, these patients, maybe I'm just not well informed on the patient population, but isn't it kind of obvious they have high intracranial pressure? So I guess to what degree and what accuracy is it clinically relevant? Is it kind of like, yes, they have elevated or they don't? Or does every sort of, I don't know, down to the 10th of a, sort of whatever level of pressure you're sensing, does that matter?
That's an awesome question. So now we get back to data and stakeholders, right? So in order for doctors to trust our device, right, we have to baseline it off of the gold standard. And the gold standard is these invasive sensors, whether they're, in some industries, in some kind of etiologies, it's a lumbar puncture. In others, it's a bolt sensor, which is, it is a brain sensor, but it's a continuous monitor. And then others is this external ventricular drain, which goes down into the ventricles and essentially CSF is siphoned off. And so we have to demonstrate to the clinical community that it is representative of the same tool you would want to use, but you can't for whatever reason. So we're going to take this information that we get from here in the algorithm and say, look, it's accurate based on this study and this study. And then we're going to go to communities where, our essentially our go-to-market strategy is to get into communities where they don't have access to that all the time, right? It doesn't make ethical sense to put a sensor into these other people, right? So about 6.5 million people in the US come into the emergency department with either head trauma that doesn't elevate to the very obvious, right? Like you talked about, like usually we're just throwing those in, like we know those people are in really dire straits, or they come in with non-traumatic headache. But that whole population is essentially at risk of intracranial hypertension. And we can either do point assessments that don't tell us what the pressure is, like CT scans and MRIs, or we can do really quick and dirty kind of presentation analyses like Glasgow Coma Scale, where we're asking questions and things like that. The struggle is because we don't have like the same tools as cardiology, the triage times just go through the roof. Like you essentially sit there for over 6 hours at risk of intracranial hypertension when it only takes about 2 hours to damage the brain in that instance. So we just need better tools. And so we're essentially co-opting the data that we're getting here, which is really, really hard to recruit, but that's really for not only stakeholder validation, but then FDA. Yeah. They then believe in it in these other settings, right? So it's kind of a means to an end. We can't go the other route. We can't go, Andy hits his head. He's totally fine, but we convince him to put a brain sensor in. Like that's not fair.
But then the devil's advocate question then is like, what are the therapeutic options for your mild traumatic brain and your high school soccer concussion type patient where, you notice some elevation, but, is that like, where's the science there? Where like you're definitely going to do a drain or kind of just monitor more closely, or you have to educate the market is maybe another way to ask that question.
So our initial market that we're going to, we don't have to educate, right? So there are drugs. So the two populations that I talked about, one being non-traumatic headache, about 15% of migraines are misdiagnosed as migraines. They're actually elevated intracranial hypertension. And those individuals we have medication for, but we're just misdiagnosing today, right? So instead of giving them migraine medications like Excedrin, we should be giving them things to essentially slow down their CSF production, right? So we're essentially treating them the wrong way. And it takes about like 8 to 10 doctor's visits for those individuals to then get appropriately diagnosed. It's extremely hard to diagnose because it's like headache, confusion, blurred vision. It's just common things. Like I always joke, like I'm about to have my second son in July. I promise you, I will have all 3 of those symptoms sometime in July. Like, so I'm not going to have elevated intracranial pressure. I'm just going to be exhausted. Right. And then same thing with concussion, right? We misdiagnose about 40% of concussions within the emergency department. It's not charted, right, that we're diagnosing them that way. If they have elevated intracranial pressure, the treatment is the exact opposite for individuals that wouldn't, right? So with a concussion, we're pushing electrolytes, fluids, right? If you have elevated pressure, the treatment is actually the exact opposite. It's that let's get enough water out of your brain to reduce the pressure, right? So the treatment modalities they're just different, and we're just doing them wrong today. And it's not the doctor's fault. It's on us. We're not giving them the tools they need to get those diagnoses correct. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, no, I mean clearly there's a need, and I guess when would you use a competing product like a brain scope, for example, that's diagnosing concussion in a clinic versus CranioSense, which is obviously sensing intracranial pressure.
With brain scope and infrascanner does hemorrhage detection, right? Those are very useful tools, right? And I think there's a place for all of these things. Both of those, have very specific treatments thereafter. Concussion is a little difficult because you saw Abbott just come out with a blood test as well, right? Diagnosing concussion so that people don't get more concussions, very, very important, right? But there's no concussion med, right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can treat hypertension, right? Intracranial hypertension. There's no kind of, treatment for concussion. And that's frustrating. But what these do unlock, like what BrainScope, what Abbott might unlock, is then treatment studies where we're like, okay, well, this person has a concussion, this one doesn't. Let's treat this person with something, and see if it helps. And that kind of unlocks that, because beforehand, concussion diagnosis again, it's just really difficult, right?
You don't know what you're dealing with.
You don't know what you're dealing with. And it's the same thing with our tool as well, is the studies in like pre-hospital treatment of traumatic brain injury, and even in hospital treatment, or in the field treatment. The studies are really tough to do because you have no idea what's happening to them, right? So you're treating them in a way, but it's really hard to segment that population down and say, okay, well, we treated this person that had this very specific thing and it worked for them, or it didn't work for them, right? And so I think one of the things that our tool will unlock as well is the ability then to look at how do we better manage these individuals kind of across the care spectrum, whether it's pre-hospital, in hospital, or at home in recovery.
Yeah, you've got a whole separate business model on, being a sort of a precision diagnostic for therapies. That's huge.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
all right,
we got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah. Familiar with trying to focus on the most critical type patient. So Ryan, we're going to pivot towards the end here, and I guess I know that CranioSense has gotten a lot of funding through DoD. You mentioned that earlier, and maybe universities with grants and whatnot. I guess for a startup med device company, would you recommend pursuing DoD or NIH, or what advice would you have for somebody who's maybe going after an emergency use type product?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think grants fit in kind of the ecosystem, right, of whatever you're trying to do. I know some folks that are trying to fund purely off of grants, and they're doing well. But I think the easiest way to kind of skirt the question almost is to say that it's probably a combination of everything, right?
Got it.
I think, we haven't talked about this with speed to data, but one of the speed to data things that we found was not actually in the data that we were gathering, but the human factors data that we saw, right? So our original hypothesis was essentially to look at this artery that came out of your skull over your eye, right? And use that as our reference, our true pressure point. So we wouldn't have to go through the skull, right? So that worked, right? It just was like a human factors nightmare, right? And the only way that we would have gotten that data was to get in the clinic and to do that right away, right? So that was something that we saw, and we were able to then pivot within the grants, right? So we de-risked a lot of the technical, almost all of the technical, with our grants, right? And so it's been really powerful for us to do that. But now we see the market that we have to go to. The technical is de-risked. Now we have to de-risk ClinReg, product dev, right? We have to go through our de novo study, right? Those are things that we can recruit money quicker and spend it quicker through capital raises, right? Equity raises, more so than we can do grant mechanisms, which are non-dilutive and have this like really long life cycle. That said, one of the things that we're going to do is all those parallel pathways that I kind of alluded to, we're definitely using, or we're going to try to use grant funding to kind of explore some of those. So not distract from going after exactly what we have to do, but to leverage non-dilutive mechanisms to say, hey, we might be able to help here, or hey, we really need healthcare economics information here. Let's go get a grant to explore that. So I think there's a place for it, but it's definitely not a catch-all, right? And I don't think they want it to be used as a catch-all either, right? They want to see these products get to market, and they know that eventually, with how much it costs to get a product to market these days, you're going to need to raise equity. So I think they also like to see that too, they being the grantors.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the playbook you're following and writing, honestly, is the right one, where the clinical need is just screaming at you, right? But you need to prove the technology through the grants, which are a great way to do that. And once you've proven the technology and you see the clinical need, then it's more of a human factors productization type challenge that investors are more willing maybe to invest in if they see the finish line there. And I think your product in the scheme of like, usability is not as complex as, say, a surgical robot, but you're applying a couple things and getting going with a GUI. So I think the risk there seems like palatable and manageable, I guess, from an investor's perspective.
Yeah, but it took, it's now palatable to, right, an investor, right? This idea, and maybe it goes back to like, however risky your product is, whether it's technical, clin reg, commercialization, whatever risk you have, right? At a certain point, if it's too risky, nobody's going to invest, right? The US government was willing to invest in us because they saw the potential, right? And they don't necessarily have we need to make money on this, card that they have to play, right? So we were able to leverage that to de-risk the tech to now be in a place where, the risk is palatable to an investor.
Right. Awesome. Great. Well, hey, Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your story on CranioSense. And, it sounds like you were born to hustle and you're still doing it. So best of luck and with fundraising and all these trials you have going on. And I'm definitely a fan. And we'll follow up after the episode just to learn more about your story. So again, thanks for coming on, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us anytime.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.